Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about Chapter 3 in your text, listening. Specifically, we're going to talk about the distinction between hearing versus listening, then barriers to listening skills and strategies, the six-step process of listening, also known as the Hurrier model. So to start off, like I said, we're going to distinguish between hearing and listening because they are two different things. Hearing is your physical ability to detect sounds, the physiological process or function of receiving sounds. So when you go to the doctor and get your ears checked, this is what is getting tested at the doctor's office. In contrast, listening is the concentration on verbal and nonverbal messages being sent and to determine the meaning of those messages. Listening is actually more difficult than we make it out to be, kind of like when we were talking about just communication in general in the first chapter. But effective listening is central to fostering interpersonal relationships with coworkers, leaders, and clients. Also, relationship satisfaction is in part largely determined by if someone is an effective communicator and listening. And listening skills also have implications for productivity, teamwork, organization skills, success, and promotion in the workplace. So listening is a very, very important skill in the professional and business arena. So now we'll talk about some barriers to listening. First, we have external noise. Recall from the interaction model of communication that we talked about in a few chapters ago. This includes distractions such as audible talking during a meeting, ruffling of papers, or a cell phone going off in the next cubicle. So any sounds that are part of your environment can be external noise. Whenever possible, you should take steps to control the external noise in your environment that might interfere with your ability to listen to others, as well as their ability to listen to you. We also have internal noise, which we also talked about in the interaction model of communication. And this encompasses any internal condition or state that interferes with the communicator's ability to focus on the message. Controlling internal noise in others can be difficult or near impossible, as it may be hard to predict. But some things we can do to help others with their internal noise is, if we're in charge of a meeting, to provide breaks, to schedule them at low stress times, but also not times like Friday afternoons because everybody wants to go off and like enjoy their weekend. If you're revealing any like intensely good or bad news, make sure you give people time to digest it before you provide any more further information so that they can listen to those additional details without still processing the overarching good or bad news that you just delivered. And you can also reflect on what causes your own internal noise and be honest when you are experiencing these things or you're distracted with some sort of personal matter or a health issue that may be a source of that internal noise. Another barrier is message overload, and this occurs when a speaker includes too many details in a message, which can make it difficult for the listener to comprehend. If there are too many details, as a listener is trying to sort through them all and make sense of them in their head, he or she can lose focus on the primary message. Jargon is also an issue here. Jargon are technical words used by specialized groups. And if a message is overloaded with jargon as a part of the conversation, that can be that can provide extra challenges to engage in active listening. Also, if you're given a presentation with visual aids, if you have too many graphs, charts, images, etc., that can be distracting. In fact, that's kind of why I try to keep my slides for you all simple and just have the definitions there so that you can listen to what I'm saying as I explain the concepts further and provide examples and etc. But all you have to read is the definition. So I try to keep those simple for your benefit as a listener. There's also receiver apprehension, and this is just the general fear of misinterpreting, inadequately processing, or not being able to adjust psychologically to messages being sent by others. So this can come from a fear of new information, fear of just being judged for not remembering things correctly, and etc. Bias is any assumption we make or an attitude we have about a person, issue, or topic before we've heard all the facts. This is very, very normal. It comes from an inherent human process of categorization. We like to put things into neat little categories. We prefer having as few categories as possible. And these come from the same process that tells us to go at a green light or stop at a red light. So it's very automatic, inherent, but it still can lead to bad outcomes like bias. So we have to actively correct for this and put aside our biases in order to be effective listeners. So now we'll talk about some listening skills and strategies. First, we're going to talk about the different types of listening. So there's informational listening, in which you focus on the content of the message to acquire knowledge, like watching this lecture video, for example. We also have critical listening, in which you need to evaluate the information that is being sent. So like watching a political speech or presidential debate would be an example of when you would most likely be critically listening. We also have empathetic listening, which is listening to understand the speaker's point of view without judgment. So if a friend is confiding in you about their breakup, you want to be there for them, comfort them, and not judge them for being sad about it or any other feelings they may have related to that. There's also passive listening, which you simply receive a message and make sense of that message without giving any sort of feedback or verification, like watching the news. And then there's active listening, in which you make sense of the message and you interact with the other individual in the communication interaction to verify that your sense making is accurate. And you can do this through things like asking questions, paraphrasing, and reflection. And this is what we do at work and in business and professional settings. An active listener focuses on asking questions and will often listen to the message and then paraphrase it for the sender. So now we're going to talk about reflective listening specifically. And this means listening thoughtfully to the meaning of the speaker's words. So you consider the content of the message, both what is verbally stated and implied. In reflective listening, you often think about the feelings associated with the message, attending to both the speaker's verbal and nonverbal cues. And you make every effort to reflect that message accurately with all those components. So there's no like real single definition of reflective listening because a lot goes into it. So try to just remember some of the behaviors that embody this reflective listening. Now we're going to talk about the types of listeners. There are people-oriented listeners who demonstrate genuine concern for others in their listening. So they exhibit a lot of those reflective listening behaviors and empathetic listening behaviors that we talked about on the previous slides. There's action-oriented listeners who are listening specifically to accomplish a goal. They need the information that you are giving them to do what they need to do. There's content-oriented listeners, and these are people that like being intellectually stimulated and challenged and just enjoy the process of interpreting complex information. We also have time-oriented listeners who just like brief, concise communication. They're on their way, but they want to listen to you, but they gotta go. We also have a couple listening categories. We have conversational listening, which is, again, a lot of that reflective, like back and forth type of communication. And there's also presentational listening, like if you are an audience member or something, you're not expected to be super interactive in that type of communication interaction. We're going to end with talking about the 6-step process of listening, or the Hurrier model. The first stage of the Hurrier model is hearing, so concentrating on and attending to the message. So this is pretty straightforward. We defined hearing in the beginning of the lecture. So it's just your physical ability to detect sounds. The second step is understanding. So this is the process of attaching meaning to verbal communication or comprehending the literal meaning of the message. So pretty much like listening. And then there's remembering, which is recalling the message so that it can be acted on. I is interpreting. So this is the step where we actively make sense of the verbal and nonverbal codes to assign meaning to the information that we have received, or the sensitivity to the nonverbal and contextual aspects of the message. So it's more than just taking in the message being sent. It's that active sense making, incorporating all those other cues besides the actual words. Then we have evaluating, which is the logical assessment of the value of the message. So do we believe the message? What emotions do we associate with the message, and things like that. And then finally, responding, which is giving some sort of response to the message, either verbally or non-verbally. So that is all for today. First, we distinguish between hearing and listening, so between the physical ability to detect sounds and actual concentration on messages. We identified some barriers to listening, like external noise, internal noise, message overload, receiver apprehension, and bias. We talked about listening skills of strategies and strategies. And within that, we talked about the types of listening, informational listening, critical listening, empathetic listening, passive listening, and active listening. We talked in detail about reflective listening as well. And then we briefly went over the types of listeners: people-oriented, action-oriented, content-oriented, and time-oriented. And then the two listening categories of conversational, where you're actively interacting, and presentational, where you take the role more of an audience member. And then we finished up with the six-step process of listening, or the HURIER model. And those steps are hearing, understanding, remembering, interpreting, evaluating, and responding. So that is it for chapter 3, and I'll see you in the next one.